clouds where there are so many jets, where the jet traffic is so high that in fact you can get substantial amounts of contrail clouds that blend together. This is something very, very different.
If you were to sit down with a group of friends around a kitchen table and bring up the topic of chemtrails, weather control, or government experimentation, you'd probably get a wide range of reactions. Some people roll their eyes immediately. Others lean forward and start telling stories about strange things they've seen in the sky. And a few might say something like, "I don't know what's going on, but I'm pretty sure we're not being told the whole story." That right there is really the heart of the whole debate. For decades now, the discussion around chemtrails and weather manipulation has lived in a strange place between observation, speculation, and official denial. People have looked up and noticed long white lines stretching across the sky, sometimes lingering for hours and spreading into thin cloud layers. Others have pointed to government programs that openly experiment with weather modification, like cloud seeding. Then somewhere along the way, those two ideals collided, and what followed was a cultural argument that has never quite settled down.
Some people believe that contrails can be transformed into chemtrails when jet fuel is combined with chemical additives. They claim that airborne experiments to control the weather and slow down or reverse global warming have begun. They say that the sheer number and persistence of contrails in the sky is visible proof. Others disagree.
There's no evidence for supporting that assertion.
Who's right and who's wrong? Or is the truth somewhere in between?
Part of the reason this conversation refuses to go away is history. Governments around the world, including the United States, have been experimenting with weather modification for many decades. That's not speculation. That's documented fact. Cloud seeding programs using substances like silver iodide have been used in various places to try to increase rainfall, reduce hail damage, or encourage snowfall in mountain regions. Even today, several states and private companies continue to operate such projects. But there's another side to that history. Some government weather experiments were not public at the time they happened. During the Cold War era, for example, weather modification was even used as a military strategy. When programs like that later became public knowledge, they reinforced a feeling among many people that authorities sometimes keep quiet about controversial research until years later. And that's where the trust begins to erode.
I designed this poster as a jet contrail index to show the different types of contrails that people are seeing in the skies. And these different types of persistent contrails, I have questions about. Why these formations? Why different dispersion rates? Why do we have X's? Why do we have long parallels with wisps coming up, these persisting parallels? We have knots on a rope. What's actually going on?
Best Evidence took California environmental activist Rosalind Peterson's photos to NASA cloud expert Patrick Minnis for his opinion on the jet contrail patterns Peterson finds so incriminating.
These are some very imaginative names and very, very interesting.
Why do they come in a long line from a jet and then go to a burst?
What this shows here is a picture of a contrail that appears to go into a cirrocumulus cloud. I doubt either one of this has anything to do with this one. This may be at a different altitude.
Looking at the same visual evidence, Patrick Minnis sees contrails in clouds, where Rosalind Peterson sees chemtrails.
We have skies that show one type at the same time as another type, and we get vibrant spectrums, for example, that look like this.
This is one, a halo feature that you often see with ice crystals. There's just an infinite variety of things, as these pictures are witness. Just it all depends on how the plane's flying through, the condition of the engines, whether there's any turbulence. The atmosphere is a fluid, just like the ocean. It's full of waves. So there's an explanation for all these patterns that you see.
I think that one of the reasons that you have the jets doing what they're doing is so that they can see their experiments in space. The satellites can see them from above or below. They can see which way wind moves. They can see dispersion levels. They can see the impacts.
Dr. Wayne Evans has observed contrails using satellites and analyzed their chemical composition with a land-based spectrometer.
There's two spectra on here. One is a spectrum of the jet contrail, which is blue, and the other one is clear sky, a couple of degrees off the contrail. We've done that on several occasions, and we detected a number of gases: nitrogen oxide, nitrogen dioxide, nitric acid, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and we saw methane. We haven't seen any evidence of strange chemicals being in them.
Whether clouds or contrails, their contribution to climate change is an acknowledged fact. But chemtrail believers go a step further.
Well, jet fuel emissions lead particulates. The EPA and health officials all tell us that particulates are a pollutant and that they exacerbate asthma and other things.
Those who believe in chemtrails keep a close eye on the health of those who live under these overhead activities.
In incidences where doctors and nurses reported very high levels of emergency room admissions, 2 and 3 times above normal in 122 cities, they said it's not the flu. They said, we do not know what this is. Correspondents in those cities contacted me and reported, in their words, heavy chemtrail activity. We can go further and say that air traffic controllers in the United States have privately expressed their concern to us, the investigators, of public health problems because of this particulate matter falling down, which could very possibly be bringing down viruses, fungi, and bacteria that live and breed in the upper atmosphere.
The advancing warm air in front of the cold front is moist. The pressure's dropping, so you get allergies and all sorts of different things are occurring. And that's one reason I expect that people are associating contrails with illness or bad feeling.
Some industrial practices pollute the planet and cause global warming. But chemtrail believers also say that the evidence of higher than normal levels of aluminum and other metals in the atmosphere is a direct result of airborne experiments with climate change. The theory behind geoengineering is that scientists could put substances into the upper atmosphere that would reflect sunlight back into space, lowering surface temperatures to combat global warming. But has this concept already gone beyond theory?
These ideas have been around for a long time, and they range everything from firing artillery shells full of soil into the stratosphere to using synthetic chemicals like aluminum oxide, which, if the particles were small enough, they might float around in the atmosphere for a number of years and reflect sunlight. And finally, using gases such as sulfur dioxide, which reflects sunlight. So in effect, what you would achieve is putting millions of tiny mirrors in the atmosphere that would reflect sunlight.
The government of the United States and other governments are not going to admit to the chemtrail project. They would have to admit the dire gravity of the situation we are in. Now we are far down the road. It becomes harder and harder to admit that, in fact, this has been going on for years.
Well, I think it's not true, because the main tenet that these people profess is that there is some increase in the amount of jet contrails in the atmosphere, and therefore it's due to the expansion of these government-funded black projects. Well, the fact of the matter is that the increase in jet contrails can easily be attributed to one thing: increase in air travel, and that there is some concern about the effect that may have on climate, but not because of some kind of a conspiracy involving government agencies operating in secret to do some nefarious things.
Both parties in this case are deadlocked. Are contrails just a matter of mistaken identity? Put to the test, With the most sophisticated equipment available, will a jet fuel emission reveal itself to be a chemical contrail?
Once people realized that certain programs existed but were denied or hidden while they were happening, it becomes harder for them to simply accept official explanations at face value. Skepticism becomes the default setting, not necessarily because every conspiracy theory is true, but because people have learned that institutions are capable of withholding information. So when someone looks up at the sky and sees something unusual, and then hears officials say, "Nothing to see here," it can feel less like reassurance and more like dismissal. Over time, the conversation became more complicated. The internet accelerated everything. Forums, documentaries, social media threads, and amateur investigations turned the chemtrail debate into a global phenomenon. Some claims were clearly exaggerated or unsupported. Others raised questions that people felt deserved discussion rather than ridicule. Instead of a single theory, the subject turned into a whole ecosystem of ideals. Some people argued that governments were conducting large-scale spraying operations for climate control. Others believed the trails were part of a secret military experiment. Still, others suggested the goal was population control, environmental engineering, or atmospheric manipulation. And then there were those who simply said, "Look, I'm not claiming to know the answer. I'm just saying something is definitely going on here."
Both sides in the chemical contrail debate agree that aviation fuel, like all engine fuels, contains harmful pollutants. However, only the chemtrail believers claim that secret additives in jet fuel are being used in weather modification experiments. Could scientists test a random sample and find high levels of aluminum oxide or other unexpected compounds and solve the case? We traveled to Flint, Michigan in search of the best evidence.
I'm a laboratory coordinator here for Kettering University. This is a small jet turbine. This device is a model of a larger jet. It functions just like a large jet engine does.
Best evidence has come to Kettering University to conduct a series of tests on commercial jet fuel with a team of experts in chemical and mechanical engineering, led by Dr. Greg Davis.
After I received the call from Best Evidence, I contacted Dr. Robert Gettner in our chemistry laboratory. Then I pulled together Mr. Ray Rust. He's the technician that runs the laboratory facility we're sitting in now. This is where we actually test the fuel and test the emissions that are produced.
The Kettering staff took about a week to shift the main facility from automotive engine testing to the jet turbine experiments. Sensitive equipment was tested and calibrated with a number of trial runs. Test day began with the purchase of 5 gallons of randomly selected commercial jet fuel from the local airport.
The jet engine we have in the lab is a scale model jet engine. It does everything that a commercial jet engine would do on an airliner. And it's got the added advantage that we're running it in a lab, so it's a controlled environment. So we can control the fuel that we feed it. We can draw the samples of the emissions.
Best Evidence has asked the scientists at Kettering to look for any traces of aluminum in both the liquid fuel as well as the emissions after it combusted in the jet engine. Aluminum appears to be the metal most often identified by people who believe there is a conspiracy to turn contrails into chemtrails.
That would seem surprising to me just because of the issues that engines like this have with throwing strange components into the fuel. So it seems like if there was aluminum in the fuel, you'd have trouble with the turbine, for example, or you'd end up with metal plating showing up in the exhaust port. So it seems that that would introduce some definite problems that the engine designer would have to take into account for in order to make the engine survive that.
Meanwhile, scientists and atmospheric researchers pointed to a different explanation: contrails. Condensation trails from aircraft engines can behave very differently depending on temperature, humidity, and atmospheric pressure. Under certain conditions, they disappear quickly. Under others, they can persist for hours and spread across the sky, eventually forming thin, cirrus-like cloud layers. From a scientific perspective, that explanation fits what we see most of the time. But the debate didn't disappear. If anything, it evolved.
While Ray Rust prepares the engine for its flightless journey using our sample of test fuel, Greg Davis selects the special quartz filters. They will capture samples of soot and particulate matter from the jet emission.
So what I'm doing now is I just placed the quartz filter element into the holder. It's in here. So I'll be doing that with both of those. Now, the problem you run into with these is the amount of particulate you gather is relatively small. So things like fingerprints can actually skew your sample so much as to be unreadable. So that's why what we have to use are tweezers to touch the filter elements. That drives off any impurities.
Meanwhile, upstairs in the chemistry lab, Dr. Rob Gentner is preparing solutions to form the basis of several tests.
So what I have here is a test tube with isopropyl alcohol in it. I'm going to place a piece of aluminum metal in there. I will then add concentrated hydrochloric acid, which will mix with the isopropyl alcohol and start to react with the aluminum metal that's in there.
Sure. So it's reacting with the aluminum that's in the alcohol then, nice. Okay.
So I've taken some of the jet fuel, which you gave to me. There's some isopropyl alcohol in here.
So if there's aluminum in here, we should see it start to
See the continuous evolution of hydrogen gas. Right now what we're seeing is a separation of the layers between these two.
It cleared right up though.
Yeah. There we see the two layers, but we have no evolution of hydrogen gas.
So at least in this sample, we don't have any aluminum.
In order to further test the jet fuel for aluminum, Doctors Gentner and Davis decide on a more rigorous experiment using an atomic absorption spectrometer. The machine can detect the presence of substances down to parts per million.
So what it allows you to do is it allows you to take unknown samples and compare those samples to see where they're similar and where they're different.
The two scientists will compare the jet fuel sample with a number of other solutions, including the closely related product, kerosene.
So then what we're going to do is put our fuel samples in here, draw it in through this tube, have it atomized, sprayed into the flame, and we're going to look to see if there's any absorption due to aluminum that would be in the fuel. Yes.
Down in the emissions test lab, Ray Rust has donned his protective headgear, turned on the ventilation system, and he's now ready to begin the experiment.
One of the major inputs into a jet engine, which has a major influence on the exhaust, is the air that you're pulling in. We have a much higher level of control here than you would out in the atmosphere. Our air isn't being contaminated by another jet that we happen to be following.
Two intake nozzles sample the jet engine emission at the exit port. One leads to the particulate filter. A second nozzle leads to an exhaust gas analyzer. As the equipment goes to work, upstairs in the chemistry lab, Doctors Davis and Gertner are about to test the liquid jet fuel in the atomic absorption spectrometer.
So what we're going to do then is we've got a light bulb that is essentially producing light or radiation that is going to be absorbed by a flame.
The jet fuel sample will be sucked up as a very fine mist and burned in the flame. If aluminum is present in our sample fuel, it will give off a warm color flame.
The lamp in here is producing radiation given off by essentially aluminum foil that's been excited.
This aluminum-treated solution indicates how our fuel sample should look if the metal is present.
Now, if there's any aluminum species dissolved in our samples, that aluminum will interact and absorb some of that radiation, so the output will be different than when there's no aluminum there.
With all the tests now complete in the chemistry and emissions labs, it's time to feed all the data into the computers.
We, calibrated our equipment. We used our best level research grade equipment. I mean, we used in this project probably between $1 million and $2 million worth of equipment for testing. So we tried to go at it using the objectivity of a scientist.
Will our tests for aluminum and jet fuel support the chemtrail believers' case? Or will the results create even more controversy?
In recent years, weather disasters, massive wildfires, extreme floods, and unusual storm patterns have fueled a new wave of speculation. When catastrophic events happen close together or appear unusually severe, people naturally begin asking questions. Could humans be influencing the climate more than we realize? Could technology be affecting weather systems in ways we don't fully understand? Those questions sit right at the intersection of science, politics, and public trust. And occasionally, strange side stories add more fuel to the conversation. Take the case of Jeffrey Epstein. When documents and emails connected to him surfaced, they revealed some unsettling views about humanity and the environment. In private communications with scientists, Epstein discussed climate change and natural disasters in ways that suggested he viewed them almost as a kind of natural population control mechanism. At one point, he even described climate-driven disasters, such as forest fires, as potentially a good thing for the species if overpopulation became a problem. Now, to be clear, those communications do not show Epstein controlling the weather or possessing any kind of secret technology capable of doing so. But what they do reveal is a mindset, one that sees large-scale environmental catastrophe through a cold, almost philosophical lens. And that matters because it shows something important about power and influence. When wealthy or powerful individuals start talking casually about human populations the way a gardener talks about pruning plants, people understandably become uneasy. It feeds into the broader cultural suspicion that elites may think very differently about the future of humanity than the average person does. At the same time, there are entirely legitimate scientific conversations happening about climate engineering and geoengineering. Researchers have proposed ideas like reflecting sunlight away from Earth's atmosphere, or modifying cloud behavior to slow global warming. These technologies, often grouped under the term solar geoengineering, are still theoretical and controversial, but they illustrate that humans are at least exploring ways to intentionally influence planetary systems.
I think that there's a lot of atmospheric testing going on, and that's where some of the chemicals come from.
Rosalind Peterson and others believe that some jet contrails contain chemical additives. They are part of secret government weather modification programs. Dr. Greg Davis heads the team of technicians and scientists who agreed to examine a sample of commercial jet fuel.
So what we've done is we've conducted a number of experiments to try and look for signs of things like aluminum being in the fuel. Look for differences between jet fuel that we bought commercially at the local airport here in Flint and kerosene, which would be a very similar fuel in terms of the fuel properties as jet fuel, but it would be clean, presumably, of aluminum. And so we've been comparing those two fuels.
In other words, the ideal of humans affecting the weather is no longer purely science fiction. It's not conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy fact. But exploring a technology and secretly deploying it are two very different things. And this is where the public conversation often gets tangled. On one side, you have scientists emphasizing that current weather modification tools, such as cloud seeding, are relatively limited. They can influence local precipitation under the right conditions, but they cannot create hurricanes, trigger floods hundreds of miles away, or control global weather patterns. On the other side, you have a public that has watched governments conduct classified research, intelligence agencies run secret experiments, and corporations quietly develop powerful technologies before anyone outside the industry even knew they existed. Those two perspectives don't easily reconcile. One group trusts institutional expertise and published evidence. The other group relies more heavily on observation, historical precedent, and skepticism towards authority. The result is the strange cultural battlefield we see today. Politicians debate whether weather modification should be banned. Tech companies propose new geoengineering ideals. Farmers support cloud seeding because it may increase rainfall. Activists warn that tampering with the atmosphere could have unintended consequences. And somewhere in the middle, ordinary people look up at the sky and wonder what exactly is going on above them.
Emissions from the jet fuel were tested in a fully operational scale model jet engine.
The process produces the same exhaust that you'd get out of any jet engine.
The emissions test looked at any solid particles in the exhaust soot using a special quartz filter.
See, and you can see the difference. There's the clean side, there's the dirty side.
The filter is placed in a special device that will burn it and examine the products of the combustion.
So I'm going to just leave this closed for a minute.
The quartz filter that would have captured any evidence of aluminum in the engine's exhaust is now ready for analysis.
And now what you should see is we'll see, actually, if we watch here, you should see a couple spikes start to tape off. Well, the conclusions we found were pretty much what we expected when we started out, are that there's no significant differences between the samples of jet fuel we tested and the kerosene. If you look at that response, is essentially identical.
As an additional test, Best Evidence asked the scientists at Kettering to analyze the exhaust gases emitted by our jet fuel sample. Some chemtrail believers suspect sulfur could be used in atmospheric cooling experiments that could help reverse global warming.
EPA regulations require us to remove sulfur because the SO2 compounds are hard on our lungs. So even if sulfur compounds were good at cooling the earth off, we certainly wouldn't want to be adding them in fuel.
But the gas emissions analyzer did find minute traces of sulfur, however, within the acceptable range.
The sulfur readings looked very normal. It looks like regular commercial fuel, very similar to diesel.
There's one final test result that uses an atomic absorption spectrometer.
We're looking for absorption of that aluminum frequency light. And that would occur if there was aluminum in that fuel. And we didn't see any significant difference there. You have to realize that we're measuring things on the level at parts per million level.
Millions of dollars worth of equipment and the expertise of several chemical and mechanical engineers at Kettering University failed to locate the presence of statistically significant amounts of aluminum or sulfur compounds in our sample of jet fuel.
The problem you had with all these experiments is we did use just one sample. Now, I will indicate we went right out to the airport. They didn't pull some special sample for us. So it was just standard commercial grade fuel, aviation fuel. But people are always going to argue the fact that, well, that's just one sample. So maybe they're not doping the fuel here in Flint, Michigan.
The truth is that the conversation isn't likely to disappear anytime soon. Part of the reason is that modern technology really is pushing the boundaries of what humanity can influence. 50 years ago, the idea of modifying weather systems sounded absurd to many people. Today, we know that even small changes to atmospheric chemistry can have global consequences. Industrial pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and land use changes have already demonstrated that human activity can reshape the environment on massive scales. So when people speculate about deliberate atmospheric manipulation, they're not imagining something entirely outside the realm of possibility. They're extrapolating from technologies and environmental impacts that already exist. The question is simply how far those capabilities actually go. And that question doesn't have easy answers. Some claims can be clearly debunked. Others remain speculative. Still, others fall into a gray area where research is ongoing and scientific understanding continues to evolve.
Looking up from ground level, we can observe chemtrails that are much different from the normal condensation trail.
The visual evidence is mounting, and with it, the chemtrail believers' concerns have grown. What the scientists at Kettering University tested was commercial jet fuel. The United States Air Force did not grant Best Evidence's request for a sample of the high-performance fuel they use in military jet aircraft. And that, according to those who believe in chemical contrails, raises another concern.
The United States Air Force releases tons of aluminum-coated fiberglass called chaff over California and other states.
Chaff isn't an aluminum fuel additive. It's ejected from the underbelly of a military aircraft to confuse radar and avoid detection by enemy surveillance.
They're like little needles coated with aluminum, and they're bundled together, and they have been used since the Second World War to produce artificial targets or radar.
Chaff drifting in the air can also help scientists track wind currents.
When it's released from an aircraft, these needles are so small and so lightweight they follow the air motion. So it's a very clever way of getting wind measurements in clear air.
Chaff technology can therefore be used in tracking weather modification experiments.
The Department of Defense just a year or two ago sponsored a workshop in Washington, D.C. on weather modification. So it makes you wonder if, in fact, the military is still continuing to address weather modification in their toolkit. And that's fine. I have no problem with that.
For every convincing statistic and dramatic visual about something strange going on in the skies, there's a counter-argument from the skeptics that's equally persuasive. Whether anyone can be proven innocent or guilty, there's little doubt that the technology and the potential for chemical contrail experimentation does exist.
I've contacted the U.S. Air Force, and they said, we are not doing that. It's not true. This is the same body that has come out with a report owning the weather in 2025, calling for weather force specialists flying tankers to lay reflective particles in an operation they call aerial obscuration.
We need to take advantage of everybody on this planet to help solve the problem of global warming. If we can do it with some form of climate engineering, all the better.
According to chemtrail believers like Rosalind Peterson, Dave Dickey, and Will Thomas, the evidence seems irrefutable. They're convinced that chemicals are being placed in the atmosphere using jet aircraft and their contrails. These activities, they say, are reckless attempts at climate change, and they are being kept a secret.
In the winter of 2005, the United States government established a Federal Bureau of Weather Modification in Washington, D.C. This is a government-mandated agency whose stated mission is to modify the weather and climate. Under this rubric, I believe they could come out and admit to a chemtrail-type project.
The case we call chemical contrails may never be solved without full government disclosure. And yet neither side in the debate denies that contrails are a problem. Contrails are a natural consequence of jet travel. They spread and linger and become part of the cloud cover over the Earth. Scientists acknowledge that in this way they contribute to global warming.
We don't have 100 years. We have maybe 20 years before we start seeing some of the serious effects of climate change.
Eyewitness accounts, backed up by satellite images, prove just how widely contrails are blanketing the planet. But what isn't clear is whether any program is actually underway in our blue skies while the public remains in the dark.
I would not be surprised to see in the next year or two, as public clamor increases for something to be done to mitigate the worst effects of climate change, that the U.S. government could come out and admit to this program.
If we're not going to be able to come up with replacement technologies in time, we're not going to be able to regulate emissions in time, we're really left with taking these other extraordinary means. The goal is to reduce the warming of the Earth before the catastrophe comes.
Which brings us back to the real purpose of this conversation. This video isn't here to tell you what to think. It's not here to declare that chemtrail conspiracies are true, and it's not here to insist they're completely impossible either. Instead, what we're doing is laying out the pieces. The observations people have made, the scientific explanations that exist, the historical record of government experimentation, the political debates about geoengineering, and the strange cultural stories that have grown up around all of it. Some of those pieces fit together neatly, others don't. But the important thing is that you see them for yourself. Because in an age where information moves faster than ever and trust in institutions is constantly being tested, one of the most valuable things anyone can do is slow down, look carefully at the evidence, and think critically about what they're being told. That doesn't mean assuming every conspiracy theory is true. But it also doesn't mean dismissing every uncomfortable question out of hand. Sometimes the truth sits somewhere in between. And sometimes the most honest answer is simply this: we don't know everything that's happening above our heads, but we're still paying attention.